Thank you for joining me on the Bold Lines podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about predicting codependency patterns. Before moving forward and listening to the rest of this episode, I would encourage you to go back to episode number 8, Identifying the Roles of Codependency, and episode 10, Systems Theory and How to Interpret Family Dynamics. I'm going to be taking some information we discussed in those 2 episodes, and I'm going to be expanding it in a way that's more meaningful to people's everyday experience. I'm going to go over some of the basics of those episodes, but if you feel lost, please pause the episode, go back and listen to the 2 of those so that you can gain the full experience of today. In codependency, I do believe that there are predictable patterns through family dynamics. To a lot of people, the concept of codependency running in families is rather interesting. When most people are talking about codependency, what they tend to be referencing is romantic partner interactions. In my own work, I've come to understand that some of those patterns are mirrored or continued from childhood in the family dynamics that people grew up with. What someone experiences in their current life is certainly affected by their past, and I believe codependency is no exception. Let's go into some of that overview to give everybody an idea of what we're talking about today so we can move forward. In codependency, I believe that there are 2 main roles, givers and takers. The givers are the ones who are focused on losing themselves and sacrificing in order to gain value. Takers, on the other hand, are focused on gaining support and fulfilling a vision. Neither role is better than the other. It can seem that way in the labeling, but each role needs the other person. Givers don't seem to be attracted to givers, and takers don't seem to be attracted to takers. Each one needs the other person in order to feel stable. While people in unhealthy, toxic, or codependent relationships will say that they feel overwhelmed and they can't do it anymore, they end up doing it. They end up continuing this dynamic and a lot of times repeating it. This unhealthy dynamic in some ways is very stable. Again, stable is not healthy. Stable just means that people stick around for it. I mentioned before that givers aren't attracted to givers and takers aren't attracted to takers. They're usually just attracted to the other side. Everyone has a tendency to give and take, some people to different levels. We seem to find partners who are on the opposite side of that spectrum. Under control and in balance, I do not believe that there are inherent issues with either giving or taking. They are simply expressions of the way that we interact in the world around us, particularly with partners. The other topic to get a review of before moving forward is that of family dynamics and systems theory. The baseline belief of systems theory is that every person in a family exists as a part of an overall ecosystem. Everyone influences and feeds off of one another. Those are both an explicit and an implicit responses. Everyone is able to navigate their family dynamic because of repeated behaviors and experiences. Everybody knows what everybody does. And without any large, drastic change, people tend to continue in this dynamic. When these roles are filled, the family is stable. If the sick kid remains sick, everybody knows their role. If the healthy kid remains healthy, everyone knows their role. But if the unhealthy parent all of a sudden decides to become healthy, the family is thrown into turmoil. The family's thrown into turmoil because the balance has been upset, not because things are necessarily better. Again, if that seems confusing, please go back to episodes 8 and 10 to get further insight. Okay, so let's go into how codependency runs in families. After this episode, I hope that these dynamics seem a little more obvious. That's one of the linchpins of good psychology and therapy, in my opinion. Once you understand it, it seems obvious. You start to say things to yourself like, well, yeah, of course that's true. And yes, I see it everywhere. Initially, codependency in families might be a little difficult to see. I hope that you can start to map out things in your own life by the end of it. I believe that most or nearly all codependent dynamics can be traced back to family interactions. When someone talks about having unhealthy relationships, almost every single time, if not every single time, I've talked about this with a client, they have gotten training from their family of origin. They've gotten some of these patterns trained into them before they find the partner that is unhealthy. This is not an indictment of all families, but it is a recognition that the way that we raise our children certainly affects the way that they interact with the world once they leave us. Even as teenagers, they will reenact the patterns that they've seen in their home. They will do so without a lot of context or nuance, but that's where a lot of teenagers get their issues from. Again, not all of them, but for most of them, this is where a lot of these things start, in the family. No two families are exactly the same, but I'm going to give you a case example to show how some of these dynamics play out, to show how progression of codependency follows. Keep in mind, I said that I believe that codependent patterns, giving and taking, carry on throughout a life cycle. Can they change? Absolutely. Is the context still there? Absolutely. So here is our case study. This is what we're going to look at today. And this is for no one in particular, just a case study I made up. This is in no way a client or anyone that I've worked with. So let's take a family unit. Mom, dad, married, and they have 3 kids. Mom is what I would call a covert taker, meaning she has to absorb things, she has to gain energy, affirmation, the like, but she doesn't do so explicitly. It's all implicit message. It's something that everybody understands, but no one can actually accuse her of because she hasn't come out right and said it. She is married to the giver of a father who continues to sacrifice himself over and over and over for the mother who can never be full or satisfied. Now, this mother and father have 3 children. In this case study, we're going to identify 2 children who are takers and 1 child who is a giver. When I talk about giving and taking children, that is the role that they assign themselves, not necessarily the way that they connect with mom and dad. This is where some of that training and dynamics come into place. In the case that I've given you, everyone has to give to mom to some degree. But outside of just that singular interaction, these kids have developed different ways to cope. Taker number 1 takes through positioning, meaning that they absorb from others by the way that they interact. They assume dynamics. They are able to absorb things from other people because of their training in the family. In some ways, taker number 1, the positioning taker, mirrors what they saw in their mother. They are able to gain influence through subtext. Taker number 2, this taker is someone who absorbs energy through dysfunction or unhealthy behavior. Taker number 2, this kid is the one who gets in trouble a lot. They absorb energy. They need support. They need giving from everyone around them because of how unhealthy they are. Their dysfunction in some ways balances the family out, even so much so that this dysfunctional taker has enveloped this identity into their core sense of self. They don't know who they are without being messed up. And so they continue on being unhealthy, going to treatment, needing rehab, all of the things. The third child, the last one in this dynamic, is the giver. In some ways, they mirror their father a whole lot. They continue to give. They're seen as soft and caring. They're often considered kind and loving by those around them because they're always willing to work and sacrifice. The problem is, because of the family dynamic, this kid who might have been a naturally loving and giving child has had their sense of self-sacrifice used against them, and they no longer know how to find identity outside of losing themselves. Again, in this whole dynamic, mom is still the ultimate taker. Everyone else has to give to some degree, but their personal subsequent roles have just been identified. I'm going to go over them one more time. Mom is a covert taker. She absorbs energy from everyone around her, but doesn't do so explicitly, and so keeping on the idea of plausible deniability. The father continues to sacrifice and lose himself for his wife in order to maintain connection and sense of stability. There are 3 children, 2 of them takers, 1 a giver. The first taker does so through positioning. They do it through subtext. They're able to absorb energy from people around them by the way that they move, mirroring their mother. The second taker enacts relationship through dysfunction, through negative interactions. They need because they're just so gosh darn screwed up. The third child, the giver child, is the one who mirrors their father, continuing to love and support everyone around them until they personally have nothing left. These types of systems support mom to the dysfunction of the whole family, even including mom. Remember I said at the beginning of this episode, codependency isn't healthy and all of these roles have specific issues. Even though mom is the taker and it seems like everyone supports her, mom can never actually be happy because there is no sense of balance and self-sacrifice. Kids will then, over time, become specialists in their assigned roles. While everyone gives to mom, these assigned roles that they've picked up will become more entrenched in their minds and in their relationships. Now let's move on to the predictions of our imaginary case study. When we talk about children who have experienced unhealthy or codependent dynamics in their family, they have generally 2 options, with one more likely than the other. Children will either continue the same role that they picked up, they will continue on with the general dynamics that they've experienced, or they will flip to the opposite role. The taker will very likely continue to take in the world around them, whether that's positioning and needing everyone to support them and tell them that they're so special, or the other taker who will continue in such great dysfunction that everyone needs to support them in order for them to even live, and the giver who will lose themselves over and over and wonder why they've been drained their entire lives. However, there can be some variation, and this is what we'll go over. This is where some of that prediction takes place. The positioning child taker, the first child that I talked about, the one reflecting mom, will either position a partner or they will feel guilty and try to overly support someone else until they can't anymore. This is one of the more complicated parts of giving and taking. Sometimes what people come into therapy with, or how they initially present, isn't truly the way that they understand the world. They might be reactive. For the positioning child, it would be very obvious if they continued the exact same role that they did growing up. They learned it from mom. They honed the skills from mom, even if they gave to mom. However, this positioning child taker might be reactive and decide they don't want to do it anymore. However, without working on their issues, without processing the past and dealing with the family dynamics that got them there in the first place, their giving will be limited. They might feel shame for the way that they've treated other people, but their support will only go so far because it's not how they truly understand the world. It's not something that they've actually examined. And so if they do decide to become a reactive giver, eventually it fails and they revert into the dynamic that they hated in the first place. And this is the dynamic where some people will say, I sound just like blank. In this case, this positioning child taker has become the mother that they so despised over the years, or maybe admired to some degree. The dysfunctional child taker, the one who gains energy and connection through their negative interactions, whether that's addiction, whether that's poor behavior, getting arrested, whatever it is. They will either continue to spiral into extreme danger, or they will feel they have to pay a great debt towards greater society or the people around them. This dysfunctional child will interestingly be stable in their dysfunction. They will continue to use drugs. They will continue to do all of these things and somehow make it out alive. I believe that comes from the codependent pattern that they picked up. They found a sense of stability in being unhealthy, and so they will continue to do it until eventually the consequences fully catch up with them. Now, this extreme danger can become scary, but it's likely for the dysfunctional child taker that grew up that people look back on their lives and say, well, yes, of course they got arrested. It makes sense. Or, of course they're an addict. They've been doing these things all along. Now, can we blame them for the bad things that have happened to them? Maybe, maybe not. Obviously, there are specific instances where that may or may not apply. However, looking at their overall dynamic, it's likely they'll continue to spiral until they ultimately crash and burn. Then they can decide whether they can get enough support to do it all over again or become so shameful that they decide to change. That great debt that I was talking about, this overall burden towards greater society or family, is something that I've seen a lot of in working with addiction. Someone finally sees the light, realizes that they've affected everyone around them, and goes on a crusade to make everything right again. This dysfunctional child taker suffers from the same problem that the positioning child taker did. Their reactive role into the world around them isn't genuine. It hasn't actually addressed underlying issues of needing to feel support, insight, or energy in order to feel any sense of value at all. It's purely something done out of shame, and therefore will fail. This greater debt towards society will never actually be paid. In some ways, the dysfunctional child taker knows this. In some ways, they don't, but they will continue to do so because they feel so bad. The last child of the three, the child giver, will either find people to support endlessly to their own danger or detriment, or start to make demands they cannot even explain or support. If the child giver continues on their role, they can easily find people, roles, even jobs around them where their bleeding heart is well welcomed. Unfortunately, their well welcomed heart is easily abused because if they are not able to divorce the stress and trauma they experienced in childhood, they will continue to find their mother over and over again to try to be enough, to support enough, to love enough in order to gain value. It's something that wears many, many people out. I've seen this in other therapists quite commonly. They'll talk about how their own childhood wasn't great. And so they work with clients and they'll let clients drain them to such a great degree that it becomes unhealthy and they're worn out. Instead of trying to help everyone, these therapists that I've spoken to over the years need to find balance. Taking isn't bad in therapy as a therapist. It teaches clients balance. You cannot just be a therapist and give to every client. You enable them by doing this. But back to the child giver. Let's say that they've been giving all of their lives and they finally had enough. Either they burn out and they don't know what to do with themselves, or they start to make demands that they can't explain or support. What do some of these demands look like? Well, sometimes they're come up with on the spot, or sometimes they've been brewing for years and years and years. The child giver might want retribution for all of the ways that they've served, and no one has served them. This is the explosion of personality that I've seen a few times in therapy, and I'm sure is much more common in general society. This child giver finally says they're done, and they are owed their due. Much like the other two children, they will ultimately feel guilty or misaligned with this goal. They're only doing it to balance the sense of discomfort or misalignment in their identity, and it will ultimately fail. So, if you have found yourself in any of these roles, are you doomed to continue them either in the same exact role that you found in childhood or in a reactive sense? Well, obviously not. I'm a therapist. I want to help people work through the things that plague them. Some of that is through direct feedback. Some of it is through general examination. It's important to understand without acknowledging this dynamic that I've spoken about today, this continuation of codependency from family, we will end up repeating patterns that we hate. So many clients have come into my office and said, I've ended up just like I never wanted to be, or one of the more interesting ones, I married all of these people swore that they'd never be a part of the dynamic again that they were unable to examine. It could be considered their own fault, maybe, but this is complex. It requires a lot of vulnerability. Without acknowledging the ways that we were trained, the dynamics that we grew up with, and working on and making peace with those things, we are pretty well doomed to repeat it. So if you want to make this change, I would encourage you to go back and listen to the case study. How does it apply to you? How does it not? Was there giving and taking with your parents that was more explicit? If so, some of these dynamics might seem a little bit easier to understand. I will remind anyone listening, finding balance is key. We all have tendencies towards giving and taking, but we all need balance. And we cannot find it through just a partner. We have to learn how to connect. We have to learn how to borrow from each spouse, their giving and taking tendencies. But all of this is predicated on the understanding that the relationship tendencies we grew up with affect us today. I'm going to end with what those kids might have needed in our imaginary case study of these 3 children. What is it that could have actually helped them? Let's start with the positioning taker. As a therapist, I would encourage open vulnerability and accountability for their actions. Just because their expectations weren't spoken aloud doesn't mean that they weren't there. Just because there were all of these things that they mirrored and they can point back and say, well, my mom taught me that, it does not mean that they are not accountable and have to own up to the ways that they played these interactions out with others. I would also give them reassurance that they shouldn't have had to lose themselves for their mother or partner. Just because someone is needy as a parent doesn't mean you have to give them anything. That's actually an important dynamic in parents and children. When the children are supporting the parents, they in some ways become a pseudo-parent. And that's a big, big problem. The positioning taker needs to learn how to sit still, to be in open vulnerability and truly examine the ways that they have navigated and in some ways sabotaged their own life. What did the dysfunctional taker child need? They need to allow consequences to follow through. They need to feel all of the things that they've done, but they also need to be given compassion and care. It's this intricate balance of accountability and empathy. They have to feel these consequences through the lens of life and love. You experience consequences not because you are necessarily awful, but because that's life. And you get the same life as the rest of us. They have to be taught about peace and the ability to slow down and find value outside of needing support. That they can have value. People might actually engage with them and interact with them just because of who they are as a person, not because something terrible is happening. To the last child, the giver, I would assure them that those who truly love them will welcome their help, but they will not require that they lose themselves along the way. They should recognize and enforce emotional boundaries in their own lives, not just for their own sake, but for others. That giver child can very easily become an enabler for the world around them. It is draining and confusing, and for the clients who are experiencing this dynamic, their responses need to sound harsh. The funny thing is, when I teach this to the giver child, they say they're being mean, but everyone else says they're just having boundaries. Thank you for listening today. I hope that this podcast episode was helpful to you. It can be rather complex. I hope you follow this podcast to get weekly updates wherever you do find your podcast episodes. share it with someone who might find some interest in it. I'm also going to be putting in a link to ask a question. If there's something about a specific episode that piqued your interest, shoot me an email. Or if you have a question about something entirely different, do so as well. I hope you come back next week as we start talking about one of my favorite topics for therapy, observing ego. But until then, keep walking towards healing and caring for those around you.